welcome, Mr. Hendriks. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin discussing your work at MSF, we were wondering what initially drew you to humanitarian aid work?
Oh, see if I can still remember. I mean, the funny thing is that I don't think I've ever wanted to do anything else. I've always been curious. I've always been worried about other people, about the state of the world. And I think if I did not do this job, I would be incredibly angry and incredibly frustrated every day. And by doing this, somehow it gives me a lot of peace of mind to be able to feel that I'm doing something about some of it.
Very interesting.
And before joining MSF, you've worked at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Was there a specific reason that you left the UN and decided to pursue a career elsewhere?
Oh yeah, there were many reasons. I thought working for the UN was great. It's a different world altogether. I mean, the UN is a massive international machine. When it works well, it's truly impressive. Like when it functions, when everything clicks, the UN can mobilize in a way that almost nobody else can. But it's also slow. It's expensive. They spend too much money on staff salaries, including on mine, which I felt awkward about. Mm-hmm. And it's an organization where it's very difficult to make use of your own autonomy. You're a very small cog in a very big machine, and it's extremely hierarchical. And an organization like Doctors Without Borders, I'll consistently call it MSF, because in the organization we use the French term, Médecins Sans Frontières. In MSF there's a lot more freedom to do what you think is necessary.
So you are the Deputy Director of MSF Operational Center Amsterdam, but also the Director of MSF Netherlands. What do these titles mean in practice?
So it means in practice that I am responsible for everything that we do in what we call our home society in the Netherlands. So what we do here is work that is in support of the medical humanitarian mission of the activities. So the work we do here is, of course, fundraising, which is important. One of the things that makes MSF unique, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit, is that we take no government money. And so that means that we rely almost exclusively on public support, a couple of companies, a couple of foundations, but really broad public support is the foundation of our existence. And yeah, for that we need to be represented in the Netherlands. So there's fundraising, there's communications, there's the advocacy, trying to meet with ministries, trying to meet with members of parliament, all the way up to the Prime Minister, if we can, to make the points about humanitarian work that we feel need to be made. And of course, recruitment, trying to find talent that can help us in our humanitarian work. So that's all the Netherlands. And then the international side is the headquarters for our international humanitarian work that sits here in Amsterdam. That's the part that I've always worked for in the past as a humanitarian worker myself during my field missions, my field assignments, and as the Deputy General Director, I'm responsible for essentially helping to lead the international machine as well.
So moving on from that, what do you say would be then the direct impact that your work has on the ground?
Oof. It's an extremely difficult question because, I mean, impact suggests measurement, right? Yeah. And there's certain things that we can measure. I mean, we can measure the number of patients that come to us. We can measure the number of lives saved, probably. Yeah, and so that impact is massive. We try through advocacy, through communications, to have impact on sort of root causes as well, and to speak out about the injustices or the crimes or the concerns that we witness. But it's much harder to gauge our impact there. I mean, whether something changes because we said something or for another reason, it's very hard to attribute that. And our ability to really meaningfully, substantially address root causes, I think we have to be modest about that. So I think it's more important for us to look at the individuals that come through our clinics, that come through our hospitals, that benefit from the water and sanitation work that we put in place, and look at the impact that we have there.
Yeah, and we can imagine that working on the ground at the MSF carries significant emotional weight. I don't think anyone could do this job, not everyone can do this job. And do you struggle not to take it all home with you?
I don't. I don't know if that means that I'm a sociopath, but I don't think I could do this job if I did.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, I don't think it's a skill that only a few people have. I mean, if you look at we have people from all walks of life that work for the organization. It's a delicate balance between being motivated by the outrage or the concerns that you feel, which I think is an extremely strong driver for action, and one that I appreciate, that I have myself, and that a lot of my colleagues have as well. And on the other hand, when I just started out doing this kind of work, I did still feel that I somehow had to change the world or wanted to change the world, or I had a much bigger sense of what my contribution could be. And I think now that the expectation of what I do is more modest, it's also easier to say that at the end of the day, when I feel that I've done all I can do, that's enough, and then I can sleep easily.
Yeah.
Okay, so also moving on from the more personal side of things, and before we move over to the more nitty-gritty aspects of humanitarian aid, we want to discuss the structure of MSF, because it can be quite complicated for outsiders. So you have 5 operational centers, branch offices, and MSF International. Could you please explain what all these different organizations do?
I can, but I'll try to keep it very short, because this is extremely boring, and if I take too much time doing this, then the room will empty out. But I think the most important part to remember is MSF is a movement. That means that essentially we are led by our members. And anybody who is currently working or ever worked for the organization is a member. And so that membership comes together in general assemblies once a year, and they vote on motions to direct sort of the course of the organization. There's in most of the countries where we work, there is such an association, a group of people that has a history working for the organization and that can vote and determine the direction of the organization. And so, yeah, you're right. We have currently 6, because a recent new one opened in Western Africa. 6 centers from which we organize our humanitarian work, really the operational centers. One of the 6, one of the larger ones, is here in Amsterdam. And in addition to that, there is a wide range of home societies where we fulfill those functions of fundraising, of recruitment, of communications and advocacy. And hovering over that is an international office that serves to essentially guard the trademark and the logo of MSF, because one thing that is super important is that all those entities that make use of the logo use it responsibly and use it in a way that is truly humanitarian, neutral, impartial in nature. So that, because that logo, at the end of the day, that logo is what we paint on the top of our cars. That logo is what we paint on top of the hospitals. That logo needs to offer protection, and that only works if everybody uses it in a diligent manner. And the international office looks at that.
Okay, very interesting. But of course, MSF is not the only aid NGO out there. There are many others. And does MSF actively try to cooperate with these counterparts?
So there's the political answer, and there's the truth. So the political answer is yes, of course. We spend a great deal of time coordinating with other actors, and we find that very important. The real answer is that MSF has at times, inflated idea that it needs to go at things more autonomously. Actually, being a little bit more collaborative is probably something that we should improve. But the fact that we don't take government money does put us aside from, I think, a lot of the humanitarian sector a little bit. There also, in terms of the speed with which we can respond to emergencies, there is no process of first making a request to a donor and saying, okay, we've observed an emergency there, can we please get some money to respond there? And it means that our decision-making structure is different, and that we will often not necessarily take time to coordinate a lot before moving into action. And then subsequently, yeah, of course, we do spend time coordinating. And I think there's a particularly close relationship with the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, from which MSF split off in the 70s. And there is still sort of a warm cousin relationship between the two. So there's definitely a lot of coordination there.
Interesting.
And the 2 main principles of the organization are neutrality and advocacy. What would you say they mean in practice? Like, what purpose do they serve?
I would say the principles, the official, maybe we can even say old-fashioned humanitarian principles are neutrality, impartiality, independence. And then advocacy is a tool in trying to reach that objective. I mean, we could devote this entire session to the meaning of the word neutrality. It's a daily discussion in our office, in our country programs, what it actually means to be neutral. I mean, as an example, let's take Myanmar as an example, right? There's a military government in charge after committing a coup d'état there, and when in the days following the coup d'état, there was a massive popular uprising against the military. Now, is it neutral to say that we want to sit exactly in the middle between one party that is very obviously morally wrong and a people's movement that is trying to resist oppression? Is it neutrality to sit exactly in the middle between those two? I mean, a lot of people would argue, or at least historically would argue, that it is. And I think we are more and more realizing ourselves that neutrality itself is something that is a process of negotiation, and that neutrality, more than anything, means that we follow the interests of our patients first and are not distracted by the interests of governments or warring parties. And as long as we put the interests of a patient center, then I think whether that's politically neutral is a bit of a different question.
Exactly. So, for example, an example of when MSF violated their neutrality principle was during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, when they openly denounced the violence and called for an international intervention. So in that moment, the advocacy of their organization violated the neutrality principle. How do you balance advocacy and neutrality without sacrificing one of the principles in the name of the other?
So I think the point is that I would say that we didn't violate the principle. I would say that if we look back at it now, we realize that it's not a rock solid, hard concept that never changes or adapts to circumstance. So I think the tension is more strongly between the practical risk of speaking out in a given situation. I mean, if we take the example of Sudan or the example of Sri Lanka, those are both contexts where MSF at some point was kicked out of the country because of the way we expressed ourselves about what we witnessed during the conflict. So a tension that I think we feel more strongly is between, on the one hand, our ability to provide assistance to populations in need, and on the other hand, tell the world about what we see and what we think the world needs to be aware of. And of course, that role is changing, because when we did that 20 years ago, it was without, everybody having a camera on their mobile phone, and we were often the only ones on the ground that were able to see what was going on during a conflict. Now there is a lot of citizen journalism, and a lot more visibility what happens in even the remotest corners of the earth. And I think the contribution that MSF makes becomes more about the credibility of our voice. The fact that we can make a statement based on medical data, based on patients coming into our clinics. It's not as such an opinion, it is an observation of medical consequences of conflict.
Yeah, and so neutrality is in a way a means to an end, with the end being maintaining access to vulnerable populations and conflict-ridden areas. However, in practice, aid can inadvertently support local power structures, and negotiations can empower interest groups. Considering this, can help ever be truly apolitical?
Whether it can be apolitical?
Yeah.
No, the medical principle that the medical staff working for MSF embrace, like any medic anywhere, is do no harm. And I think as time goes on, we realized more and more that the presence of an organization can do harm as well. I mean, whether it's about creating dependency on the assistance that we provide, or whether we inadvertently benefit one side of a conflict more than another. Yeah, we are not in that sense we don't operate in a vacuum. And of course, our presence somehow affects entities that move around us as well. And I think the central challenge for us is to do that in such a way that it is truly patient and people-centered, and that we don't get instrumentalized. And that, of course, is something that happens quite a lot, and I'm sure we'll come to it when we talk about Gaza later on. That risk of instrumentalization is always there, and it's why we need to fall back on those principles.
MSF is active in a lot of different war zone conflicts and crises, from earthquakes to famines and wars. How does this varied typology of crises change the way MSF needs to operate in order to provide the best care for those patients?
There's a massive difference, and indeed. So we respond to conflict, we respond to disease outbreaks, and we respond to natural disasters. In a way, natural disasters is at times the hardest one, because, well, first of all, they often occur in countries with relatively strong governments that don't have a particular interest in a private organization like MSF coming in, observing their response, maybe critiquing their response. In many countries, a response to a natural disaster is led by the military. So there's a lot of competition for space there, and it's also crucial in any natural disaster that you are responding within 48 hours. So we're primarily effective in countries where we are already present, in the areas where we are already present. Now, the good thing is that we're present in over 85 countries, so very often there will be a team on the ground that can contribute to a first response. I mean, a conflict response is entirely different, right? And the assessment you make of medical needs in conflict depends also highly on the nature of the conflict and the type of violence that you are witnessing. Do you need to set up a program to support survivors of sexual violence? Is it a program where the biggest concern is the collapse of the regular health system? Because in that case, you might start providing care for people with chronic diseases. There's many conflicts where more people die of untreated heart disease than of trauma. So the question of what is the most appropriate set of services depends entirely on the very specific set of circumstances.
Yeah, and MSF is one of the only organizations that operate in some of the most conflict-ridden areas, such as Kunduz, Afghanistan. What gives you the ability to continuously access those high danger zones?
Well, first of all, we are not continuously able to access them. For us too, there's all the time we need to move back and forth based on sort of the I would say that it's probably true that our risk acceptance or risk appetite is maybe slightly higher than some other organizations. But for us too, I mean, we must care for our staff, right? We must make sure that the risk that they take, that the risk we ask them to take are somehow acceptable and manageable. But there's a couple of different lenses to look at the way we want to bring about the security and safety of our staff. And if you simplify it, you can break it down into three sort of domains. There's principles of deterrence, where essentially your protection, your safety comes from having a bigger gun than somebody else, right? That's how armies try to ensure their security. You've got the principle of protection, which means that you bunkerize, where you draw up a high wall and hide and only move out occasionally. That's how a lot of UN entities work. And it also works to provide safety for your staff. And there's a third angle, which is acceptance, which is where you derive your safety and security almost entirely from making sure that the neighbors and the local community around you see value and importance in your presence. And if the shit hits the fan, if something nasty is going to go down, they're always going to know before us. I mean, it's their country, it's their village, it's their town. And the idea is that they come to us because they care about our continued presence and say, there's risk now, lay low.
Okay.
And that's the acceptance strategy that a lot of our security management is based on. But yeah, it relies very strongly on sincere relations with the communities in which we operate. So we have to get that right.
And during your operations, at times you have to negotiate with armed or paramilitary groups. Could you shed a bit more light on how that looks like and how do you handle those situations?
Yeah, so a lot of my time working for this organization was spent doing that. It's both part of negotiating your access into a conflict zone, but also part of the responsibility you have for the safety and security of your staff. Almost all armed actors are rational actors as well, and work with a particular interest, with a particular agenda. And most, but not all, have some desire over territorial control or influence over an area. And in almost all cases, it's in their interest for a population to have access to some sort of care so that they don't grow restless, protest, or resist. From our side, it's of course imperative to provide for a basic need. So often, even armed actors, even the ones that we would consider to be war criminals, can be appealed to on a rational basis. But of course, there is tension because a lot of the times they are reluctant to have people observe what they're doing as well.
You talk about the need to create broad support within the local populations to safeguard your workers. Could you please explain how MSF is uniquely able to do this compared to, for example, the UN requiring them to, as you say, bunkerize?
I mean, I don't want to cast too much shade on other organizations because the idea of a needs-based approach is one that I think has been embraced by almost universally embraced throughout the sector. The fact that we are highly dependent on locally recruited colleagues. I mean, any country program is 95% staffed by locals. The fact that we have that acceptance strategy, that means that it's a requirement for our own safety to be embedded in local structures, and the fact that we have maybe a slightly higher risk appetite means that it's a little bit easier to be part of those communities and to ask the questions, or at least that's how I felt it myself. The connections existed to ask people what they needed. But in our case too, I mean, the whole sector still falls short of truly listening to communities and people in need, and we're also not yet at the level where we need to be in having a sort of a truly patient-centered approach. That's still an ambition that is unfulfilled, I would say.
And based on this, you also talked about engaging with these armed groups. But I can also imagine that among the local population, which you're trying to cultivate a good relationship with, there was some displeasure or like anger towards those armed groups. Does engaging with those armed group ever damage your relationship with the local population?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we very frequently get asked, why did you speak with that guy, or why did you speak with that person? I mean, they're the ones that did this to my family. And at the same time, it's not difficult to explain to people that for us to be able to continue our services to them, we need to be able to be on speaking terms with everybody. It's not an endorsement. It's not an expression of liking somebody. I mean, there is literally nobody that we would be unwilling to talk to if that meant being able to reach people that require medical assistance. I don't care at all about the number of crimes that they have committed. I mean, I care about it, but I don't care about it in terms of being willing or unwilling to speak to such parties. And the fact that we ourselves can say that there is no government money directing our actions also means that when we reach out to whether it's communities or warring parties or warlords or militias, we can say that there's no strings sort of pulling us around. And that's still a sentiment that I think, I mean, in many parts of the world, they are extremely mistrustful at the start, especially of an organization that they perceive as having Western origins. The perspective that we are spies coming in to somehow observe what's going on is always there.
And zooming in on a discussion about places in which MSF currently operates, Sudan is widely perceived as being one of the worst humanitarian crises right now. What are some of the humanitarian risks in Sudan at the moment?
I mean, every risk in the book is playing out there at the moment. In terms of the extreme access challenges, where just the other day there's a refugee camp with about 400,000 people in it called Zamzam camp in Darfur. We were blocked for weeks on end from bringing in the nutritional supplies that were needed to keep children under 5 fed in the what we call an intense therapeutic feeding program. And I mean, we're really talking about the type of feeding that is required to prevent starvation. we were unable, because of consistent bureaucratic obstacles, because parties manipulate the aid that we're trying to bring in. Yeah, we were unable to consistently guarantee that supply line. So supplies are challenging. There's immense risk for the staff involved, and then primarily for our local staff that don't have the benefit of the international outrage that would occur if one of our international workers get killed. The fact that our structures, our medical structures, I mean, one of the biggest worries I have at the moment, not just in Sudan, but also in Gaza, also in Myanmar, also in Ukraine, the complete lack of respect for IHL, for international humanitarian law, the fact that the protected status of a humanitarian worker and medical facilities seems to be completely disappearing, evaporating, means that those structures are increasingly becoming targets themselves as well. And the risk of being a humanitarian worker in that sense is going up. And to be honest, I'm not sure that in today's world, I'd be comfortable taking all the risks that I've taken in the past 15 years.
Yeah, so on this topic of, like lack of respect for humanitarian law and targeting of humanitarian aid workers, also in Sudan, but not only, how can MSF maintain safety for their teams while at the same time providing this urgently needed medical care?
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of time goes into security management. And so, first of all, whenever you go on an assignment for MSF, you need to realize that a measure of risk acceptance is part of that. We cannot mitigate all of the risk away. And so everybody that works for us in our country programs acknowledges that there is an element of risk in it. Our task is to bring the level of risk down to a level that we see as acceptable. And you can do that by, investing a lot in your relations with the warring parties and the local communities, by ensuring that your assistance is relevant to as many people as possible, by having a very strong understanding of conflict dynamics of a local context, where you really analyze the typology of different incidents. So, okay, what is the day of the week that incidents are occurring? Are violent robberies more likely in the late evening or the early morning? Are there particular days in the week, for example, on a market day when there are more people on the road where attacks are more likely? Like, you analyze all those factors and you try to determine, okay, when is it safest to move? When is it safest to visit or go to a particular location? Because it's generally movements where we are most exposed. And you try to bring down that risk to an acceptable level. That's the mitigation. And then there's contingency. So when things do get fucked, which happens, what systems do you have in place to respond when something goes wrong? And that's about always having, well-qualified emergency medical staff, part of your team. It's about having crisis structures in place so you can make quick decisions when there's an abduction or another risk materializing, and that you have invested in those relations. So if something does go wrong, you can call up the head of the army in the area, or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or whoever it is that you want to get on the line and say, this has happened, we need to act now.
So we already briefly talked about access restrictions, but we were wondering what causes groups like the groups in Sudan to feel like it's in their interest to cut off aid to camps like Zamzam?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really know. We don't really know. The fact is that aid and the provision of aid is a lever of power, right? And both the ability to bring in international actors or humanitarians and say to the people that you're leading, look, I got these people here and they're doing good for you and that's thanks to me, that is a source of power. And being able to cut off that supply line is also a source of power, and it demonstrates control and it elevates dependency. If they themselves then come in with, whether it's poor quality or even a small amount of assistance, it's an opportunity for them to in that sense, the realpolitik of it can be really quite frightening, and the extent to which warring parties all over the world, because this is not unique to a particular context, the extent to which they're willing to victimize local populations in a struggle for power is really, can be really hard to see.
What does this cutting off of aid mean for the people on the ground experiencing it?
I mean, it depends on the level of dependency, right? I mean, if we take an example of, let's take the refugee camps in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, where the Rohingya Muslim minority population from Myanmar, expelled from Myanmar during a genocide in 2017. There's a population there that lives in the largest refugee camp in the world, but that camp is completely fenced. So people are not allowed to move in and out of a camp. They're not allowed to work, because then they would be competing on the local labor market, which the local government doesn't want. So you create a situation where you have an immobile population that is large in size, that's not allowed to work. Yeah, then the aid dependency becomes total. And so if you were to stop that, it becomes life-threatening. There are also projects where our presence is more about dignity of people and more about solidarity and standing shoulder to shoulder with people going through sort of the hardest time of their life. We've been present for a long time in detention centers in Libya. We were unable to get people out of those detention centers. Yeah. We were also unable to provide high-level quality of care because we couldn't take them out of the detention center into a clinic, but we had to do everything there. But the act, so yeah, if we left, probably medically, they wouldn't be much worse off, but they'd be alone. So yeah, the impacts are different.
And MSF also had, in rare occasions, pulled out of places that it deemed too dangerous to operate in, such as in Fiji in the DRC. At what point would you say does it become too dangerous for MSF to continue their operations?
I think the crucial turning point, well, there's a couple of, the first answer is it depends. But the second answer is, I think the primary concern is when we become a target. When we feel that, because we are set up and equipped to some extent to deal with the risks of collateral damage, right? With the risk of generalized violence, and to reduce the risk as much as we can for ourselves in such circumstances. But if we are being targeted, if we are, then I'm not sure we are able to protect ourselves against that, especially in the absence of security procedures that are about deterrence, having a bigger gun, or protection, completely holding ourselves up behind walls and barbed wire. And since we're unwilling, usually, to use those strategies, we can't work in places where we're being actively targeted. And thankfully, that doesn't happen so often.
Aside from Sudan, which we just talked about, one of the other places you're active in is Gaza. Could you explain what MSF is now doing in Gaza to provide care?
Yeah, I can. I mean, it's really it's a complicated story, and it's a story of two sides. Like, on the one hand, I don't want to give the impression that what we are doing there is somehow great or sufficient, because it isn't. The fundamental. So on the one hand, yes, it's meaningful. There's the program that we do right now. It's largely oriented around trauma surgery, obviously, because there's lots of shrapnel and bullet wounds, and then the post-operative care following trauma. But there's also a strong mental health component to it, because I think the psychological distress in Gaza is deep and extreme. And we're investing heavily in water and sanitation, bringing around clean water, supplementary feeding to stave off malnutrition, and mother and child care, specifically around births, including the capacity to do C-sections, because otherwise every complicated pregnancy might result in both maternal and infant mortality. So while that range is strong, and I'm really impressed by the bravery of the colleagues that are doing that work, I think we are at a quarter of our actual capacity. We currently have, 30 international staff and 600 local staff on the ground in Gaza, and we would probably be 4 times as large if we were just allowed to bring in the people, if we'd get the visa, if we'd get the supplies, if we wouldn't be blocked and obstructed every step of the way. So yeah, the frustration is also there about knowing that we are falling short, knowing that what we are doing is insignificant in the face of the total needs. And it elevates the importance, again, of us speaking out about what we see, because we are on the ground, we do have eyes there, we are able to witness. And it's not about me. It's in that sense, again, not about taking a political stance in the conflict, but it's about speaking truly about the observations we make while providing medical care of the consequences of this war on people.
Recently, UNRWA, one of the most important aid organizations for Gaza, was banned by Israel. What does the banning of this type of organization have as effect on the people of Gaza?
Yeah, it's an unbelievable decision, and one that we were worried about for some time that it was going to happen. I mean, the bill was sent to Parliament, to the Knesset in Israel in February already. I mean, UNRWA is a quasi-government. That's how you should see it. I mean, the network of schools, of warehouses, of distribution centers that they have, there's no other entity that can match that. They have thousands of staff in Gaza alone, and certainly while being prevented from scaling up. They are definitely the largest player on the ground, and for us too, when we do distributions, for example, we often do it in locations that they oversee. So there's going to be huge negative consequences to banning UNRWA. And and there's a second dark element to it too, which is that they're being banned under counterterrorism legislation. So that means that they're not just banned, they're being criminalized. And organizations that continue to collaborate with UNRWA are thereby also criminalized. And my big worry is that it could be a path towards legitimizing targeting UNRWA facilities, where of course many other humanitarian actors are also present. And as such, I really see it as a step towards further criminalizing humanitarian assistance in this conflict altogether.
Building off of that, you already said that you are forced to work under capacity, but is MSF worried about them but also being banned from operating in Gaza?
Yes, I mean, there's being banned, which is one worry. There's the risk of being targeted, which is another worry. I mean, we engage with the Israeli government on a daily basis. It's not that it's impossible to have a dialogue. But at the end of the day, we have to weigh up for ourselves whether we feel that the impact that we can make on the ground is big enough, and whether it justifies toning down some of our expressions, the way that we speak about this conflict. Because of course, to some extent, we have to moderate the way we talk in the interest of patients that rely on our care. And the question of where the balance lies between at some point saying, oh, okay, maybe we should actually forego the assistance for the people that were provided to favor a more assertive approach to speaking out about the things that we see. I mean, I don't think we will get there soon, because I think that our medical impact is too important, and I feel that we have until now been able to speak relatively truthfully and freely and explicitly. But we're constantly questioning ourselves on that.
Yeah, and also, as you've said, MSF has increasingly become the target of attacks. And Christopher Lockyer, the Secretary General of the MSF, gave a speech at the UN addressing this, in which he talks about MSF buildings being shelled, workers being detained, trucks being attacked. Does this type of action make you less likely to keep operations in these areas? How does this coincide with, keeping your team safe and the fact that now that you are the target of attacks, do you pull out? Do you continue to operate?
Yeah. I mean, if I were a lawyer, I would say we have no evidence that we, specifically as MSF, were targeted during those attacks. At the same time, I think we conclude that the health infrastructure in Gaza is being systematically dismantled. I think there was interesting research done by the Yale University that looked at satellite imagery, and at some point they found that it was 4 times more likely for a health structure to be hit than any other random building. So there's a clear discrepancy in the targeting, and we see a deliberate approach to cripple health sector industry. And yes, we have, 8 of my colleagues have died already in Gaza. If you look at the number of healthcare workers and humanitarian workers that are dying there, it is currently also 4 times more dangerous, statistically speaking, to work in this war zone than in any of the other war zones that are already risky. So the question of whether it is possible for us to continue to operate in such an environment, again, it's a daily consideration. And our risk-taking, of course, depends on the impact that we see that we are having in terms of the benefit that we give towards patients and the local population. And if that benefit is high, then our willingness to assume risk is higher. And that's the reason that we're still there.
What response is needed in order to protect international humanitarian law and allow the provision of essential medical care to vulnerable people?
Well, the response that is needed is that all of you go out there and impress whoever you can of the importance that humanitarian law, it's not just a piece of paper. It's about the lives of my colleagues and the ability of the entire humanitarian system to work in a way where we can help people in need. And the way that we're currently going, that entire principle, providing neutral assistance to people in need, is under threat.
If you walk by your building, it was just right around the corner here, you will see a big sign that says ceasefire now in Gaza. And that decision was made, I think, quite some time ago to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. What motivated this decision to speak out at that moment that a ceasefire was necessary while also weighing possible access questions that we've already discussed here? How was that decision made?
Yeah, well, I think the most important point is that I don't think calling for a ceasefire is a political statement at all. If we again go back to that principle of advocating for the rights of our patients, I don't see any political angle to that. And our calls for a ceasefire are not the reason that we're facing risk in Gaza. I don't think that is the case. It is calling for circumstances under which we could operate more effectively. I mean, that scale up that we talk about, the capacity that we have ready to go to be bigger and more meaningful in Gaza, it requires a decrease in violence and it requires improved access. So yeah, it's both a principle in itself, having a ceasefire, but it's also the requirement for us to be able to step up more.
Okay, now I think we would have time to open ourselves up to some questions from the audience. Maybe this back row. Yeah, please. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, Mr. Hendriks. So I'm currently a third-year PPLE student at UVA, and I would just like to know what is your opinion on how the government can collaborate with NGOs like Médicins Sans Frontières on, achieving the goals, because we've seen that recently, for example, in Congo, that the government's working together with the UN on developing a DDR. And I was wondering, how do you think that, what is the role of the government and how can they effectively support the works of the NGO?
So I think it's first of all important to realize that we as an NGO, and especially as a humanitarian NGO, we have no desire nor capacity to replace the government, right? And we are not in the business of substituting government services. We can only, our capacity is not large enough to take on such a task. We need to choose carefully where we intervene. In terms of collaboration, in many contexts, the most important partner that we have is the Ministry of Health. So we don't exist in isolation. And when we spoke about collaboration before, one default collaboration is with local health staff running the clinics, running the hospitals that already existed. And sometimes our main activity will be to make sure that they have the supplies, or that we rehabilitate, reconstruct the hospital that they work in so that they can just carry on. And in other cases, we might see that it's necessary to do something more autonomous or independent. But for me, that is the main angle of collaborating with the government, because otherwise we don't want to be an extension of their policies on development or humanitarian assistance or health even. That's we're by definition a temporary passerby. And if we create a situation in which we become part of a system, we're building ourselves a difficult challenge. It's a hole that's hard to dig yourself out of.
Okay, I think we have time for another question or two. Yeah, please, maybe gentleman in the jacket.
Hi. My question is regarding mental aid or like psychological aid. Would you say that it became or it's becoming more important, or that you guys become more aware of it? And as you just said, you are more or the organization is more of a temporary passerby. How would you facilitate those options? Because usually psychological aid is more of a long-term project, and it's not just, short.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And it's not easy to provide meaningful mental health assistance in a condition that is still extremely volatile, right? Because any psychologist will say that the first important thing to do is to get somebody out of a situation of distress, and then from a situation of stability, work on recovery. And you're right, most of the time we are unable to do that. So there's a couple of different angles that can take. One of the first thing we do is what we call psychological first aid, which is really giving people an opportunity to decompress. And you don't need to be a psychologist to be able to provide that service. It's really more of a listening ear. Then we also work in more chronic contexts where there is enough stability to provide more counseling and more regular, whether it's private counseling or group counseling. And there are instances where we really need to take upon us actual psychiatry, right? There's parts of the world where there's basically no professional group of psychologists and psychiatrists that exist, simply because it's a profession that people don't get trained for. And then in some cases we take up some of that responsibility as well. But a lot of effort goes towards helping people develop coping mechanisms rather than actual treatment.
Thank you. And then I think we have time for one last audience question to the girl in the scarf.
Thanks so much for your work and your interesting answers. You mentioned that you do not take any government funding, and I found this quite surprising. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a bit more on the pros and cons and how you came to that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was always a small amount of our income, or a relatively small proportion. But for a long time, we did take some assistance from European governments. I don't think we've ever taken from the US, because they were implicated in so many wars that it was impossible to take the money. From the European Union and from several EU member states, we did for a long time take money. But then in 2015, following the EU-Turkey deal, we started operating a search and rescue vessel in the Mediterranean Sea. And we saw that we were rescuing people that were direct victims of European policies of exclusion. And we felt that we could no longer be credible in taking that money on the one hand, and on the other hand being a search and rescue actor. So we essentially said we don't want it anymore. And we had to hope that the general public would respect that decision enough to compensate for some of the financial loss that brought with it. And more or less that proved to be the case. But it's one of the reasons why, in the Netherlands, 450,000 people donate to our work. And really, both in terms of amplifying our voice and trying to make a point, and in terms of making sure that our decision-making is autonomous, that is really the cork on which we float.
Okay, thank you so much. And now, slowly coming to an end of our conversation, inevitably MSF concludes an operation. How is that decision made?
Well, ideally, we will have put in the initial plan exit criteria. and we will have said, okay, if the level of violence goes down to this level, or if the capacity of the local Ministry of Health goes up to this level, we're going to cease our activity and we're going to hand over. The reality is that that isn't always possible. I mean, the students of conflict in the room will know that, generally speaking, conflicts increase in length, and there are many conflicts in places where we work that have gone on for 15, 20 years, sometimes even longer. So there are not always circumstances from which we can extricate ourselves. So sometimes that means that we have very long-term presence. And yeah, you can have emergency situations that last for 2 decades, unfortunately. And at other times, we sometimes simply need to conclude that our presence is more necessary in another location, and that as such we need to reprioritize. And it's important that we also have a dynamic portfolio of activities. We don't want to be stagnant and operate only in a given set of places without the ability to move around and respond to new crises. So yeah, there are some really tough decisions that somehow need to be made.
Upon leaving, obviously you are an emergency aid organization, but how can you make sure that you still leave a sustainable and capacity building impact there? Or is that not something that is the goal of MSF?
I would say it's probably not the primary goal, but it's not something that, I mean, we have to factor it into our consideration. And I think the biggest contribution that we have is that in many places where we work, our hospitals and clinics essentially function like an education system. And a lot of junior health staff come through our hospitals and clinics, work with us for 5 years, and are experienced and competent healthcare professionals by the time they come out and then move into the healthcare system of the country in question. And yeah, the collaboration with the Ministry of Health, it's one of the reasons that we do it is not because it's easy, because a lot of things would be much easier if we just did them on our own. And they would be faster if we just did them on our own. But it is accounting for the moment that we inevitably need to leave, that we need to have invested in that relationship. And ideally, by that time, it's a year-long relationship of trust, years long, where at some point they say, okay, we're going to take it over. But usually it also means a drop in quality. And that just has to be accepted.
Taking that into account, MSF provides an influx of resources to places where previously there were virtually non-existent. How can you prevent things like aid dependency that when you leave, people are still able to access some form of healthcare?
So I'm not sure we are always able to prevent it. I mean, there is some tension between the concept of providing life-saving emergency assistance and people being dependent on it, because the fact is that often something did not exist before we arrived, exists while we are there, and may no longer exist after we leave. And eliminating an element of dependency completely there, I'm not sure is possible. And yeah, investing in staff that work with us, investing in collaboration with local health actors is probably the best way we can go about that. And asking communities the question, how do you think we can prevent this? And then seeing if there's something we can contribute. But I don't think we always succeed.
Yeah. And now, finally, the part that organizations such as MSF play in the response to humanitarian crises cannot be overstated. However, we are wondering, what would you say is the role and responsibility of the individual? In what ways can members of our audience help?
No, I'm really glad you asked. So the reason that I was keen to be here is that, as I said, we are a supporter-driven organization. And part of it is about money, yes, for sure. But not all of it is. I mean, it's also about being a movement of people who are concerned about the way that we care for people in difficult situations. And whether that means that you write a letter to a parliamentarian, or that you decide to organize a fundraising activity yourself, or that you join our fundraising team, or that you express yourself publicly in support of humanitarian law or of the work of humanitarians. Those are, I think, all things that we need also a whole new generation to take up as something that they care about and something that is close to their heart. Because otherwise the group of supporters is slowly going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I mean, you are, I hope, part of the group that will carry forward the relevance of international humanitarianism, because I personally feel that it is not an outdated or obsolete principle at all. I think that that basic notion of solidarity with people, regardless of where they are, yeah, it's maybe a bit cheesy, but it's still something that really fuels me every day.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Hendriks, for this conversation and for being our guest today. Let's please have a big round of applause.